Hey everybody, John Flino here from Insightful Recordings, and today I'm going to be teaching you the basics of audio compression. Before we start diving in, I'd like to make it clear which form of compression I'm speaking about, as there are generally two situations in which you use the term compression in audio. The first is the one we'll be learning today, which deals with a reduction in the dynamic range of audio, which in simple terms is just making a loud sound quieter. This is typically used as a common tool throughout the mixing and mastering stages of audio engineering. The other situation where the term compression is used is when speaking about audio file size, where you might downgrade the quality of a file in order to save space. But we're not going to be worrying about that today. When I first started audio engineering, I had the hardest time understanding compression and couldn't find any resources that dumbed it down enough for me to understand quickly. So that's my goal for this video, to get you to the point where you can open up any compressor, understand the parameters, and get right into shaping your sounds. But now that we know what form of compression we're talking about, we need to answer the question, when would we want to use the tool of compression on your audio? And really the answer to that is pretty broad. There are tons of circumstances all the time during mixing and mastering where compression is necessary, either for controlling a very dynamic sound or simply sculpting a sound to achieve your creative vision. You can use compression heavily to really make a sound a consistent volume, or lightly just to smooth out some peaks in the waveform. There are compressors that will color your sound with saturation or distortion, and there are compressors which will not affect your sound beyond dynamics at all. Hopefully, by watching this video, you'll be able to begin diving into compression in all your mixes and start experimenting with the many forms of the tool out there. Let's move on to understanding the different parameters of a compressor. For this video, I'll be using the stock Pro Tools compressor, as it has a pretty easy to follow interface with some or all of the parameters that you're going to see on any other digital or analog compressor. The main settings we have are threshold, ratio, attack, release, knee, and output or makeup gain. Let's go down the list and explain each in depth. Threshold. Audio volume, being measured in decibels, fluctuates constantly throughout a waveform. When you decide that you're going to be compressing an audio signal, the first step you need to take is determining the loudness at which you want compression to begin occurring. This is where the threshold comes into play. Most compressors will allow you to set the threshold manually, where each time that your audio signal's volume reaches that threshold, compression will begin to occur. With that being said, there are some compressors that work differently, where the threshold is fixed at a certain volume and the user is expected to use other controls to determine how the compressor operates. Ratio. The ratio of the compressor, in simplest terms, determines how compressed the audio signal will become after passing the threshold. A signal that is 6 decibels above the threshold with a ratio of 2 to 1 will be reduced to 3 dB above the threshold. That same signal at a ratio of 3 to 1 would be reduced to 2 dB above the threshold, and so on. Ratios like 2 to 1 and 3 to 1 are considered light use of compression, and ratios like 8 to 1 up to 20 to 1 and beyond are considered quite heavy compression. As with all these controls, the settings you choose will be determined by the type of sound you're working with, but also simply by what sounds best. Experiment with a tool and see how it affects your sound differently across various combinations of settings. Attack. Attack is a commonly misunderstood parameter for compressors. It's measured most often in micro or milliseconds. It determines the amount of time it takes after an audio signal passes above your threshold for the maximum amount of compression to occur, as determined by your ratio. Attack is not a delay of compression after the signal passes the threshold, as the compression can begin occurring immediately after the threshold is passed. It simply smooths out the transition from uncompressed to your chosen ratio of compression. Release. Release is the opposite of attack and determines the amount of time it takes for a signal to go from fully compressed to not compressed at all. It's commonly set in milliseconds or seconds, with very fast releases causing a sort of pumping effect and slower releases resulting in a smooth transition in volume. A sound with many short, fast peaks may benefit from a quick release, while a sound with more drawn-out peaks, such as a bass guitar, may benefit from a slower release. Knee. Knee is an interesting setting and is often confused with the functionality of attack. Its purpose is to make the compression kick in more gradually or aggressively as a signal reaches a threshold. While attack deals with time, knee deals with what is most often referred to as a shape. If you have a hard knee, the compressor will begin working toward its set ratio the moment the signal passes the threshold. If you have a softer knee, the compression will gradually kick in as the signal approaches the threshold, potentially resulting in a less obvious compression effect. Personally, I prefer a harder knee for a more aggressive sound on something like drums, but usually a softer knee on vocals to keep them sounding natural. Output or makeup gain. The final parameter most often seen on compressors is output or makeup gain. This parameter is pretty simple. It allows you to add additional output volume to your signal after the compressor processing has completed, often used to make up for the volume lost during the compression. Adjusting this parameter does not affect the compression itself, only the volume of the signal as it exits the compressor. So now that you learned the basic controls of a compressor, let's try adding compression to some audio. Right now, we're just going to be using some programmed drums, just so that we don't have to worry about cleaning up the audio. They're already isolated and we can just really focus on the compression. Here's a little pattern that I threw together. And we're going to start with a kick. So let's solo out the kick. That's what it sounds like dry. So let's head back to our mix screen. We're going to add on the Pro Tools stock compressor and let's get a loop going here. So first thing I'd like to do is try to get my attack and release time set right. Basically, when setting my attack, I really like to focus on letting the initial transient of the sound come through at near full force and then have the compression fully kick in slightly after that. So we're going to try, I don't know, something around 30 maybe to start, 30 milliseconds, and play with that. Let's also pull down the threshold to a point where the compression's kind of obnoxious, and then we're gonna pull the compression off later. This way we can just really hear how much of the attack is coming through. I kind of like that. Okay, so let's pull off this threshold. And as you can see, we have this little orange arrow here. It's giving a visual of where the threshold is in relation to the volume of the signal coming into the compressor. So compression begins as soon as this signal passes this little orange arrow. And then let's pull our ratio back down to like a 3. We'll pull this threshold back down a little bit. Maybe bump it up to a 3.5. And we'll try and pull this release down a little bit. And now over here, it happens very quickly, but you can see this GR means gain reduction, and it's showing you how much reduction in volume you're actually getting. Because it is happening so fast, it doesn't really stay long, but there will be a little line there that you can see that shows you there is gain reduction happening. So let's hear the dry versus what we have right now. Now, what we're seeing right now is that our output is actually a little bit lower than our input. So let's try using the makeup gain to bring it back up to volume of the signal that we are actually getting on the way in. Okay, so we're actually at or a little above our initial input signal. So now let's give it a listen back and forth again. So off. So it's pretty subtle, but what we've done so far is kind of fattened up the kick a little bit and made it a little bit more consistent in volume across the board. It brought up the low end to kind of, it almost lasts a little bit longer throughout the whole hit rather than just being a quick thump at the beginning. So if you think about it, what we have going on here is those louder parts of the sounds, like the initial transient, those are reduced in volume, while the decay, where it's a little bit quieter, now we have brought back up in volume with everything else. So those louder parts of the sound, like the transient, are back up to where they were in volume, but those quieter parts are now higher in volume as well, closer to where those initial transients were. And that is your reduction in dynamic range. There's less fluctuation in the dynamics of the sound. Let's try pushing it a little harder to kind of give it more of a creative sound and less of a just simply practical sound. So now the compression is a little bit more obvious. You can hear it between the dry and the affected. Kind of slams a little bit harder. Might be cool in some contexts, might be too much in others. It really depends on what you're going for. Let's try the same thing, but on a snare. So here's our snare soloed out. All right, so let's start playing with the parameters here. Same thing, we're gonna go for the attack first. I'll probably set it like 50, 60, release a little bit faster. We might even bring this up a little higher, maybe like 80. I don't know. We'll play with it. And if you notice before, I didn't touch the knee. I like a hard knee on drums just because I like the more aggressive sound. For ratio, maybe we'll pop it around 4. And let's see. I don't know. We'll move the threshold around once we start listening. So let's hit play. I'm going to loop it, and I'm going to start dialing in a cool sound. All right, so that's kind of a more aggressive sound. Let's hear that on and off. Now you can hear between those rolls and stuff, there's a lot less fluctuation in volume, which honestly might sound a little bit better when in context with everything else, because those lighter hits might be pretty hard to hear. And on top of that, we've kind of heavily compressed it so that it kind of makes the snare sound like it's being hit harder too in a way, or it just sounds a little bit bigger. Let's hear it in context with everything else. Let's just listen to the on and off of both the kick and snare compressors with the cymbals added in. So that should make it a little bit more obvious what the compression is doing. It's really fattening up both the kick and the snare and making the volume consistent amongst all the hits. Now, depending on what you're doing, you might go a little bit harder or lighter than that, but simply for the sake of this tutorial, we're just gonna roll with that sound for now. Next, I just wanted to give you a visual on an actual audio waveform of what the compression might look like. Over here, we just have this snare top mic, which there's a little bit of a fill going on here, and then just a snare and tom build, but we just have the snare top mic, and I'm just going to show you a visual of what an uncompressed versus compressed audio waveform looks like. So here's our first one, and then here's like the snare and tom build thing. Yeah, we're not really going to go for anything practical here. We're just going to obnoxiously compress it just so you can see like what's actually going on. So here's your uncompressed signal, and then let's compress the heck out of it. There you go. What you just saw is you see a lot of the peaks have kind of shrunk down, and the quiet stuff in between the peaks, like the decay and anything else going on in between those hits, has been brought up in volume. So here's your unaffected versus affected. Obviously that kind of sounds ridiculous. You actually put more time into making that sound good, but this is just so that you can actually see what's occurring. Again, here's your snare and tom build. And then here's a heavily compressed version. It sounds ridiculous, but now you can actually see what is happening to the audio when it's being compressed. Lastly, what I want to do is just take a quick look at some other types of compressors that you might run into. This one right here, it's a Waves plugin called the CLA 3A. What you see here is we have a gain knob, which again, it's just your output gain. And then we have peak reduction, which is basically like it's like you're taking the threshold, and as you turn this number higher, you're moving the threshold down more, therefore increasing the amount of compression. This compressor limiter switch right here, this is basically your only form of setting the ratio on this one. By default, the compressor mode has like a 3-to-1 ratio or something, whereas a limiter is a term used for compressors that have a very high or infinite ratio, basically used as a means to anything that's passing that threshold, they want squashed right back down to the volume that the threshold is set at. We'll just use it in compressor mode right now. For this view display, I don't really change these often from setting it to gain reduction. You can see output, input, or gain reduction. I just leave it on gain reduction. I mean, you don't even need to really worry about looking at the meter at all, other than if you're confused, if it's not working at all, you can look at the needle to see if it's moving, but I really don't pay attention to the meter. You really should just pay attention to whether or not whatever you're doing sounds good. As for these other things at the bottom, this is just like a noise emulation thing that's particular to these certain types of Waves plugins. And this high frequency thing, it basically is making it so that if you turn it to the left, the compressor is more affected by high frequencies, whereas if you turn it to the right, it makes it equally affected by all frequencies. We're gonna just turn it to the right just so that we have something that's working like most other compressors do. And I threw it on the snare. Let's solo out the snare, and we're gonna try and dial in a little bit of a cool sound with it. I mean, I personally already like this better than the stock Pro Tools compressor, and it was pretty easy to quickly dial in a bit of a cool sound. Let's hear it on versus off. I mean, I think it sounds pretty cool, and we were just able to set that pretty easy. Let's try out a different one. So this is also by Waves. You're gonna see a bit of the same parameters down here. You see this analog noise thing, which I always just leave off. You have your meter select, you have your gain reduction, input output, or you have a bypass right here, which turns the compressor off. And then there's two different versions of the plugin. They just sound a little bit different. I personally like the blacky one most of the time. And then we have a ratio, attack, release, output, and input. Again, our output is just makeup gain. Our input, on the other hand, is something we haven't seen yet. It's basically changing the volume of the signal coming into the compressor. You basically have a fixed threshold, and the more you turn the input up, the closer that you bring your input signal to the threshold and beyond the threshold to therefore have higher amounts of compression. You also have your attack and release like we've seen before. On this one, it's numbered a little bit weird. You have 1 to 7. 7 just means fastest, 1 is slowest, and the range, it varies a lot. It's one of those things you just have to kind of play with it and listen to it and figure it out. And then over here for our ratio, we have a ratio of 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1, 20 to 1, or all, which is basically closer to a limiter or just a really heavy compression sound. Let's just put it at like 8 to 1 right now. And we're still on the snare. We'll try to set a really slow open attack and then a pretty quick release. And then we're just gonna play with the input and output as we listen to the playback. You can really hear how the sound changes when cycling through the different ratios. And it's pretty cool to have the buttons on this one to just quickly switch between them rather than turning a knob to particular numbers. Yeah, for this particular one, I like 4 and 8. 4 sounds a little bit more natural, 8's a little bit more aggressive. And just for the sake of it, let's try the all buttons in mode. It's cool sometimes, but it's a little obnoxious. Plus, we were clipping a little bit there. That's what that red light signifies. Lastly, let's just give it a listen, bypass versus on. I personally like the LA3A a little bit more, but this one, if we kind of tweaked it a bit more, we could probably get a pretty sweet sound out of it too. All right, so finally, let's just give it one more listen to the kick and snare with the cymbals without compression versus with compression. And there you have it. That's the basics of compression right there. That's how I would go about tweaking the controls to get a sound that I like. Obviously, I would also be doing a bunch of EQ and perhaps some other effects to try and really get the sound I'm going for. But as for compression, that's pretty much what I do right there. Sometimes I'll layer different compressors one after another to try and mix two different sounds together, or sometimes I'll do EQ before compression and then again after compression, or maybe just before or just after. You really just have to kind of play with the sound, figure out what you like the sound of, and just try and tweak things until you are moving closer and closer toward the sound that you're actually trying to achieve. But anyways, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.